Let's talk about one of the greatest triumphs in human history, the story of how we defeated smallpox. It's an incredible tale of terror, of folk wisdom, and a huge scientific gamble that literally changed the world. And it's all thanks to a very, very unlikely hero.
And that brings us to the central mystery of this whole story. The word we use for this life-saving miracle, vaccine, has a really surprising origin. So why is arguably the greatest achievement in all of medicine named after a cow? To figure that out, we have to take a trip back in time.
First off, you have to understand the enemy. Back in the 18th century, smallpox wasn't just some disease. It was a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature, a plague so feared they called it the Speckled Monster.
Just look at this. The mortality rate for smallpox was a horrifying 30%. Let that sink in. Nearly 1 in every 3 people who got sick died. Now, when you compare that to something we know today, like the modern flu, which is way down here at less than 0.1%, you really start to get a sense of how devastating this was.
And the sheer scale was just mind-boggling. 400,000 deaths every single year. And that's just in Europe. And this thing, it didn't care who you were. It killed peasants in the slums, and it killed monarchs in their palaces, like King Louis XV of France. Nobody was safe.
And the experience of getting it was just awful. It would start out kind of like a bad flu with a fever and aches, but then a rash would erupt all over your body, and that rash would turn into these deep, hard pustules. People said they felt like shotgun pellets under the skin. And even if you survived, you were often left with terrible scars for the rest of your life, or even blinded. A true nightmare.
But, humanity didn't just surrender. The first real shot we took at fighting back was this incredibly risky procedure that came from the East. It was a dangerous gamble, and it was called variolation.
So what exactly was it? Well, it sounds pretty gnarly, but variation involved taking actual material from a smallpox sore and scratching it into a healthy person's skin. The idea, which was famously brought to the West by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu after she saw it in the Ottoman Empire, was to give you a milder case of the disease so you'd be immune for life. And hey, to a certain extent, it worked. Variolation dropped that terrifying 30% death rate all the way down to just 1 or 2%. A massive improvement for sure, but still a deadly roll of the dice. There was actually a famous trial in 1721 where 6 prisoners on death row were offered a pardon if they did it. They all survived, which really proved it had potential.
But, and this is a huge but, there was a fatal flaw. A person who got variolated got a real case of smallpox. A mild one, yeah, but they were still contagious. This meant they could, and they often did, start completely new, full-strength epidemics just by walking around.
So the world desperately needed a safer way. And as it turns out, the answer wasn't in some fancy London laboratory. It was hiding in plain sight, disguised as simple folk wisdom out in the English countryside.
For generations, there was this common knowledge among dairy workers: milkmaids were famous for having smooth, beautiful skin, totally free of pockmarks. And the shared belief was that by catching a really mild disease from their cows called cowpox, they somehow became immune to the horrors of smallpox.
And this wasn't just some myth. Decades before Edward Jenner gets all the credit, a farmer named Benjamin Jesty put this idea to the test. In 1774, when a smallpox epidemic swept through his village, he took a stocking needle, gathered material from a cow, and inoculated his own wife and kids. And guess what? They all survived the outbreak. But for his brilliant thinking, he was mocked by his whole community for treating his family like cattle.
So Jesty proved the folklore was true. But it would take a country doctor, someone with a scientific mind, to turn that rural observation into a medical procedure that would change the world. And that doctor was Edward Jenner.
So this right here, this is the experiment that basically became the foundation of all immunology. In 1796, Jenner took fluid from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand. He then inoculated an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps. James got a slight fever but recovered in no time. Then, Jenner performed the ultimate and frankly terrifying test. He deliberately exposed the boy to live smallpox. The result? James was perfectly healthy. The theory was proven, he was immune.
And here's why Jenner's discovery was such a revolutionary leap. You see, variolation used the actual deadly smallpox virus, which made patients contagious. Jenner's method, which he called vaccination, used a harmless cowpox virus, which meant there was almost zero risk of transmission or death. It was safer, it was more reliable, and it was something you could actually scale up to protect the whole world.
But public acceptance? Oh, that
did not come easy. The very idea of injecting yourself with material from a diseased beast, it was horrifying to a lot of people. Wild rumors started to fly. People were afraid it would make them sprout horns or start bellowing like cattle. There's even a famous satirical cartoon by James Gilray that shows vaccinated patients with tiny cows literally growing out of their bodies. But despite all the resistance, science eventually won. So now let's jump forward to the 20th century for the final global battle against smallpox and to finally uncover the origin of that all-important word. Okay, so by the 1960s, the World Health Organization launches its final assault. But instead of trying to vaccinate every person on Earth, they used this incredibly clever containment strategy called ring vaccination. Whenever a case was found, they'd isolate the patient and then vaccinate everyone they had been in contact with, creating a ring of immunity that literally choked the virus out. It broke the chain of transmission. And this brings us to the final, really poignant bookends of the disease. In 1977, a hospital cook in Somalia named Ali Maumalan became the very last person on Earth to contract smallpox naturally. And he survived. Then, tragically, just a year later, a British medical photographer, Janet Parker, became the very last person to die from the virus because of a terrible lab accident.
So, let's get back to our original question. What's in a name? Well, when Jenner published his findings, he gave cowpox a proper scientific name, Variola vaccinae. In Latin, that literally translates to smallpox of the cow.
And right there, at the heart of that Latin phrase, is one simple root word, vacca. And it means, quite simply, cow.
Now, for almost 100 years, vaccination only meant the smallpox procedure. But then, the great microbiologist Louis Pasteur, who was developing his own inoculations, decided he wanted to honor Jenner. He proposed that all of these kinds of preventative treatments should be called vaccines.
And as Pasteur himself said, he was doing it as a direct homage to Jenner's amazing services to humanity. So every single shot we get today, for polio, for measles, for the flu, it carries the legacy of those English milkmaids and, of course, their cows.
And that leaves us with one last thought. The cure for one of humanity's greatest killers. It wasn't found in a sophisticated lab. It was found in rural folklore that was dismissed as superstition for generations. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other major breakthroughs might be hiding in plain sight today, just waiting for someone to look a little closer?